Welcome to Legislative Watch. I'm your host, Elizabeth Allen Hodge, and today's program is going to be a little different in that normally we record our program from the Capitol Annex, and the guests are usually members of the Idaho House of Representatives or State Senate. Today we're actually filming this at the television studio, and we will be also posting it to our website, and it will be on a radio as well. Our guest today is a special guest who has flown in to Idaho to deliver a presentation on America's economic meltdown, in which he will be discussing inflation, free market economics, the Federal Reserve, sound currency, and the so-called stimulus bill. John McManus is known throughout the nation as a seasoned public speaker, writer, and an expert on the topic of the U.S. Constitution. He has authored 5 books, is publisher of The New American, and president of the John Birch Society. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
In your video, Dollars and Cents, you list the national debt at over $9.6 trillion as of last September, and you state that the national debt rises at a rate of $1.79 billion per day, and the interest alone in 2007 was $430 billion. That's pretty hard for the average person to comprehend. Can you break that down on a cost per person and explain the actual true indebtedness of the U.S. government?
Well, the actual true indebtedness of the U.S. government is incomprehensible.
Okay.
If you add what they admit to, and the figure that you have is from last September, it's now $10.9 trillion.
Oh.
And the Congress has just allowed the national debt to rise to 12.2, which means they'll get there.
Oh my God.
But if you add into it the cost of unfunded obligations that the government has, Social Security, Medicare, and so forth, you're talking about $100 trillion. The United States is the most heavily indebted nation in the history of mankind. And where are we going with all this?
It's incomprehensible.
Well, it is incomprehensible, but where we're going with this is that the indebtedness is such that there will be people, and there already have been people, suggesting that we have to have global economics. We have to have globalism. We have to have a new world order. We have to give up the independence of the United States and the Constitution and get into a world government situation.
So not just a euro, you're talking about a currency that's
well,
the entire world?
Well, even the people who are behind the euro would be very happy to have a world currency. And the reason for that is it's a statement of the great leader of the Rothschild banking empire in Europe years ago. Give me control of the nation's money, I care not who makes the laws. Right? And that's what's happening to us. You give control of the nation's money to a private entity, which is what the Federal Reserve is. It's not a government agency. Then they set the policy and they dictate to the Congress. You say, okay, we need you to do this, we need you to do that, and so forth. And it's abject tyranny. And the American people have no understanding of this, except those who have allowed themselves to be influenced by the John Birch Society.
Well, now, you mentioned that the Federal Reserve, and that's something that I'd really like to get into, because a lot of people think that the Federal Reserve is
a government agency.
No, and that Congress is affiliated with it. So tell us, who owns it? How is it formed?
Well, I can't answer who owns it. It's never been audited. There's a bill in Congress right now to have the Federal Reserve finally audit the Federal Reserve. I made that statement not too long ago to somebody, and quickly he got back to me and he sent me a newspaper clipping, and it was about the fact that the Federal Reserve had just been audited. And I read through the article very carefully, and what I found out was that they'd audited the number of pencils and the number of desks. They didn't audit what was really needed. We don't know how much there is in the Federal Reserve. We don't know who owns it. We don't know a lot of things about the Federal Reserve, which is incomprehensible in a nation that's supposed to be free.
Well, and I found out when I was interviewing someone from JFAC, one of the vice chairmen, that there are different types of audits. And unless you do, I think they call it a forensic audit, you're going to get things like how
Right.
many pencils.
Right. Well, we need a comprehensive audit of the
Well,
Fed.
Representative Phil Hart told a story that there was a lady some time ago who was hit by a Federal Reserve truck. Her car was damaged, she was injured, and so she sued the U.S. government. It was thrown out of court, went all the way up to the Ninth Circuit. And finally, when the case was dismissed, it was on the grounds that she sued the wrong party, and she was told by the judge that the Federal Reserve is privately owned.
It is. It's privately owned. Now, where did it come from? Well, in 1913, Congress considered starting something called the Federal Reserve. And Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts said this entity will create inflation whenever they want inflation. Congressman from Minnesota named Lindbergh, the father of the famous aviator, he said this is absolutely wrong and it will create inflation whenever they want it to happen. And they were right. But the Congress went ahead and voted for it just before Christmas, 1913, and so it started in 1914. And it started issuing currency right away, Federal Reserve notes. Now, during that period, the U.S. Treasury had been issuing gold certificates. And they said redeemable in gold on demand. That's the finest paper money the world has ever known. You could get gold for that piece of paper. All right, but President Roosevelt took us off the gold standard, 1933, and so then the Federal Reserve changed. But the Federal Reserve notes originally had been competing with U.S. Treasury notes. After 1933, they didn't have to compete anymore with the gold certificates. There weren't any. Right? So we've been taken for a ride, the American people.
So if I understand what you were saying in your DVD and what you're speaking to now is the three kinds of money that you mentioned were commodity money, fiduciary money, and fiat money, which is what we have now. But the fiduciary money was what you were just discussing, is when you take in a silver certificate or a gold certificate and and it's basically like a receipt, and you should be able to get the gold.
Fiduciary money is based on the Latin word fiducia, means trust. Okay? Fiduciary money is essentially a warehouse receipt.
Okay.
For something in the warehouse, the bank, right? And that's acceptable. If we had that, I'd be a lot happier than what we've got today. But we had gold certificates up until 1933. We had silver certificates up until 1968. And from 68 until now, we have nothing but fiat money. And again, we go to the Latin, and that means edict. It means dictate. So they say they passed the legal tender law. And the legal tender law says you have to accept this as money. Well, that's a bit of tyranny. Why shouldn't there be competition? Why shouldn't there be private coinage? Why shouldn't there be people who are saying, no, the money that the Federal Reserve is giving us is constantly being eroded through inflation. Why don't we have something better?
So it's legal, but we used to talk in the legislature that sometimes we would pass bills and some of us would question the constitutionality of it.
Yeah, and if we what's the Constitution?
Exactly, exactly.
They all swear an oath to it, but then it's in the bottom drawer and they forget about it.
Yes, and they would say, well, it may not be constitutional, but once it passes, it's legal.
Yeah.
So this is what we have right now, is we have money that's legal, even though it's not constitutional.
Well, let's very simply discuss the subject of what has happened to the currency. When I was a boy, my mother would send me to the store for a loaf of bread with a dime. Today it costs over $2. Right. The bread costs the same. The value of the money has shrunk that much. The difference between the value of the dollar in 1945 and today is 95% of the value has been gone. Where did it go? It was eroded through a process called inflation, which silently and people unaware of what is happening to their dollars. Now, inflation is not usually understood. You go to the newspapers, you go to the politicians, you go to the TV, you go to all these people, they tell you inflation is rising prices. No. The rising price is the effect of inflation, the result of inflation. If you believe inflation is rising prices, you believe wet streets cause rain.
Well, and in your dollars and cents presentation, you went to a 1957 Webster definition that defined inflation as
Correctly.
an increase in the amount of currency in circulation